Welcome to the Week 1 Fireside Chat for Educational Leadership, 655 Pupil Services, and Non-Discrimination. So typically what I'll do in the Fireside Chats is give a few shout outs to students who've posted during the week. But since this is week 1 and I'm doing this recording a little bit ahead of time, that won't happen today. But look for that in upcoming Fireside Chat. So the Fireside Chat, the purpose is to have about a 15-20 minute discussion about what we're talking about during this particular week. So let's start out. Week 1, January 25th through the 31st, best interest of the child. Now, that's actually a legal term, best interest of the child. What's interesting, though, multiple definitions of that term always laminate it to situation and context. So if you're acting in the best interest of the child, what was the situation and context? So teachers are in a position where they are supposed to act in the best interest of the child. And that also means using their professional discretion. But here's an interesting question, right? If I were to ask you, do you have permission to activate the fire alarm in your school? About 88% of you would say, I'm not sure. Or if I rephrased that and said, what if you were in your classroom and you noticed some smoke coming out of a classroom down the hall or a closet or something like that? Would you have permission to activate the fire alarm? Again, about 88% would say, I'm not sure. Say, well, what would you do? I would try to find an administrator. So we do have these questions of discretion. So we want to know right off what your teachers feel their discretion is to act in the best interest of their students. So we want to make sure that teachers feel empowered, that they feel like they have discretion to act in the best interest of their students. So it's interesting to define that out. What is discretion? What do you feel your boundaries are with discretion? What decisions do you feel comfortable or capable of making without seeking an administrator or somebody else for input? We also get conflated terminology, right? Mainstreaming, inclusion, tolerance, acceptance. If we mixed all of those up and gave them to people at a staff meeting and just said, write down a definition for whichever one you received, those definitions would likely be similar because people don't finitely distinguish between mainstreaming and inclusion, tolerance and acceptance. So again, we don't have a lot of inter-rater reliability, right? And if we were, again, to take teachers and to ask them, what is mainstreaming, what is inclusion, we're going to get different interpretations on that. So this really sets out the groundwork for this course for pupil services and non-discrimination. And we get into areas of non-discrimination. What is bullying? What is harassment? What is equal? What is equitable? So I have a video that I recorded a couple of years ago. It is required viewing for week 1 about mainstreaming, inclusion, tolerance, and acceptance. It's a very, very good video. Mainstreaming, and I define it in the video. Think of if we had an RFID tag. If I had that on my sport coat, at any moment, somebody could identify where I was. So if I was in the regular education classroom, right, that would be known because that RFID tag would say, well, David is in there. He's being mainstreamed. But mainstreaming isn't necessarily inclusion, right? They're different. Tolerance isn't necessarily acceptance. Tolerance is very much a entry-level term. Acceptance is a much higher level of processing, of trying to understand a different perspective, almost some debate quality that comes into that. So getting our terminology clearly defined, getting inter-rater reliability across staff is a very important role for a special education and pupil services director, that people understand and can define what best interest of the child is, that it's laminated to the context and the situation of what's happening, the discretion afforded to the staff member, mainstreaming, inclusion, tolerance, and acceptance. So right there, we want to make sure we understand those terms. I have an article posted, and it is working with third-party providers. This is a very popular article. I wrote it after the district where I was working as a special education director received numerous requests from third parties to provide either services in the school directly to students, or again, doctors might be writing scripts for students to receive special education services. Of course, things don't operate that way, but the right to select methodology, that third-party article, will be very helpful in, I think, understanding how to frame a respectful position when there is a push from an outside provider, and sometimes, with encouragement also by a parent for certain practices to be delivered in the school setting, and which can result in supplanting of services. And there's just other issues that come into play with that, right? With liability. If you have a third party coming into your school to provide some services, who's liable in case something goes wrong? So this isn't to necessarily try to end collaboration with outside parties. Not at all. A lot of that happens very effectively, but through memorandums of understanding and through processes which put that in place, which are mentioned in that article. But the right to select methodology, and it also is so much that's happening out there as a special education director with pupil services, things that are covered in the media. People become very reactive and want certain programs, and they want certain actions to be then represented in the school. I remember a few years ago with the Tide Pod Challenge, right? So the Tide Pod Challenge, some districts were putting together counseling interventions for entire grade levels. Their boards won it. Their counselors, teachers, to educate students about the negative impacts of this. And what was happening, though, is it was interrupting the regular counseling curriculum, right, of what the counselors were doing. And what that district did, they had a lot of pressure from the school board because, it was very big on the media that something should be done in the district. So the district did respond, but there was something also then that got let out, got moved off that scope and sequence. So, excuse me, very low humidity down here. We want to be aware of those types of things. So also historical perspectives of special education. I do have a few timelines that I included that you can peek through. And one is, for example, like dolls. Dolls did not, were not manufactured with any indication of disabilities until, I believe it was 1950 or 51. There was a doll that had, as if the doll had suffered from polio. So, and then you can see this progression through a range of different things, obviously through movies, but there are several examples. And if we look at that too, there's a lot of representation that didn't happen until, the 70s, 80s, or even 90s. So a lot of this is fairly new. So that's also an perspective, is we are in a time when a lot of, for example, authentic representation in Hollywood. I have a friend who is an actor in Hollywood who works tirelessly for authentic representation of people with disabilities in movies. So, example, if someone is, if there was someone in a movie cast who is supposed to be hearing impaired, then that person who is cast for that should be hearing impaired, and not someone pretending to be hearing impaired. But let's get back to just thinking about our schools. So we've talked about terminology. We've talked about third-party providers. We're going to get into, and also historical perspective. So let me give you my own. I'm wearing my yellow shirt today to signify the story. So when I was a kid, right, going to school, elementary school, it was a 100-year-old 4-story building back in the day, right? And I remember that outside of the school in the back, they pulled up a yellow mobile home, a yellow, kind of like the color of the shirt, like a yellow mobile home, and didn't have any signs on it, anything like, nobody knew what it was. And this yellow mobile home was out back of the school. And every once in a while, kind of going forward, a few of my classmates would be gone for an hour or two, and then they would come back. And they would always come back with the greatest stickers that you could imagine. And I just remember, like, where are they going to get these stickers? And they were going to the special education building. That was the special education building. It was the 1970s. Idea was just taking root of how that would look in schools. It was virtually all pull-out service at that time. So I had no idea. I had no idea what the building was for. I had no idea where my classmates went, and this big mystery. And so that was my experience, right? And I also remember that we had a classmate who had a fragile bone disease, and this was a 4-story school, again, built 100 years ago. And he was one person would be on one side of the wheelchair, one on another, and they would just run him up and down these 4 flights of stairs so he could get to the upper level, which was where, like 7th and 8th grade was. And that was just the way that it was done. There wasn't an elevator, and, it was the kind of accommodation on the spot. Right. And it worked, but we go back and think, there's a video on YouTube, Children of Darkness, which I would encourage you to look. It was a PBS documentary. I think it was around 1980. And if we look at what inclusion looked like in 1980 and what non-discrimination looked like, and harassment and bullying, significantly almost ancient, compared to how we would consider that today. So there's been a lot of movement in a very short amount of time. And I don't think we always recognize that, that really, like in my lifetime, I've seen significant changes in special education and pupil services. So, kind of in wrapping up, also, we talked about intra-year reliability. Do people know what mainstream means? Inclusion, tolerance, acceptance, and also, do students understand, terminology? Do they understand harassment? Can they identify it? Do they know how to report it? It's a big thing. Also, that we have staff turnover, right? We have new staff throughout the year. We have substitute, long-term subs. Every year, new people coming in, new students moving in, families. How are we making efforts to educate them about terminology? So even though we've worked on mainstreaming, inclusion, tolerance, acceptance this year, a year or two from now, 30% of our staff and students could turn over. So, what is the process that we're using to make sure that we maintain this? And I'm going to close here with our week 1, because I do want to keep these at about 15 minutes. But I want to close also by the fact that, we need to involve students in the process. We need to ask students, what does acceptance mean to you? What does bullying mean to you? What would you do if you were seeing somebody bullied? How would you report that? Again, we put in place as adult systems, but we don't usually ask the children, we ask the students for input. And this happens often with handbooks. Here's the handbook, and yet it's a middle school handbook, but it's written all at a 12th grade level. It's amazing. I've actually checked that out in a few other classes I instruct, and we take excerpts of handbooks, and especially anything that has to do with special education or bullying and harassment. And it's usually written at a very high level. So making sure that we don't have that as a barrier, making sure that we have that accessibility to parents. So I'm just going to go through. I do have 3 monitors in front of me, so if you see me kind of looking around here, it's what I'm doing right now. Just making sure that I address those things. So please continue to be active posters to the class. And again, remember, when special education was a place and not a service, which was for me. I remember that. I remember very vividly looking out the window from the fourth floor and looking down and seeing the yellow mobile home being, I have no idea what that is. And the fact, that was the start of special education. I remember very, very, very vividly, and students just kind of disappearing for a while, how much different it was then than it is today. And of course, what happens with COVID, and what happens when students are at home? How does mainstreaming, how does inclusion, how does all of that look? Nobody really knows, right? We can have those discussions, and we can talk about it. We can measure it here from this new baseline, which has suddenly been created since March. So, all right. Thank you so much, and I will be back for the week 2 Fireside Chat. Thank you again, and whoa, here we go. All right, and here's the last one. The lightning. I can't dodge it. All right,